How's it going, Eliminators? Today we got a Honda HS622 Snow Blower that we're going to be working on, so let's get right into it. So we ended up getting a call for a pickup of a snowblower here. It's a Honda HS622. And basically this is just a little tiny one, guys. This thing's track driven, so lots of traction, and our customer was complaining that it wouldn't start. Now I did check for spark. It's got plenty of spark. So we have a spark tester here. Basically you plug this end onto the spark plug and you plug this end onto the cap, and when you pull it, there's a little light inside of here and it'll light up, and if it lights up, that lets you know that it's got spark. Okay, so I'll give this thing a little pull. You guys can see it lighting up there. So this thing's got spark. So my guess, it just needs a carb clean. Now in some of these newer snowblowers that I've seen, they have plastic shrouds over top of the engines, and they label it as like a quiet technology. But what it basically is just a sound baffle. So they'll have a big metal shroud covering, you know, the muffler, the carburetor, the gas tank, and they try to encapsulate all that noise and vibration that the engine creates, so that when you're using this snowblower in, you know, like a residential area, maybe a co-op, where there's a lot of homes in a very small area, they don't generate that much noise. But something like this, these Honda engines normally are pretty quiet from the factory. So on something like this, you know, access to the carburetor is really easy. Here's our air breather and here's our carburetor. You guys can see there's two nuts right there, and there's a little wing nut up at the top here. So if we take our air box off here, you guys can actually see there's no air filter. Now the reason snowblowers don't have air filters is because in the wintertime, all of the dirt and debris basically kind of sinks to the ground, and you don't have to worry about pollen or any kind of dust, airborne particles, because it all gets trapped in the snow. Sometimes you'll see a little metal screen over top just so that chunk of ice or something doesn't get sucked into it. But on this, guys, to get the carburetor off, fairly simple. Two little nuts here. We're going to take that off and we're going to pull this plastic piece right out. I can see that we have a couple other bolts there, but all in all, this is a relatively simple job. And because this is a Honda, we're going to be using a 10mm socket. We're going to get those two nuts off. Now the little bolt here that I showed you guys, it had a little threaded plate in behind it, so basically this thing was just sitting up behind it. So now we'll go ahead and remove that one over there. There's also one more bolt down here we're gonna have to get off, but now our plate is loose and we should be able to lift that off. Okay, now this plastic carburetor cover here, it has slots in it to allow you to basically put your fuel valve through and not worry about it getting caught up. So you guys can see there's some wider spots there. So what you're going to want to do is just turn your choke on. So we're going to turn it like that. You're going to want to turn your governor to the slow position to the right. Then we're going to come up to the top here, remove this 10mm bolt. Once you get that bolt off there, you should be able to just slide this right off. Now just be careful, guys, because these silver things in there, they're bushings, and sometimes they can fall out and you might not notice, so just be aware that they're in there and that they do fall out sometimes. But now that that's off, we have access to our carburetor. So what I did before I brought this thing in was I sprayed a little bit of carburetor cleaner into the air filter housing while the choke was off, so that the carburetor fluid could go and work its way into the carburetor. Then I turned the choke on to close off that opening so that it would suck pure carburetor cleaner into the cylinder, which is combustible, and then I gave the pull start a little pull and this thing fired right up and then it died. So the fuel's almost out. There's a little bit left. So that lets me know that either it's not getting fuel from the line because there's a blockage in the tank, or it's the main jet in the carburetor. Chances are it's probably the carburetor because it normally is. So what I'm going to do is we're going to pull this carburetor off. I'm going to show you guys how to disconnect all the linkages, and then we're also going to pull this fuel tank off and open it up, drain it out, and inspect it to make sure that there's no rust or debris inside of there. Because Hondas are notorious, because they use metal tanks, they're notorious for having rusting issues because people store these things without any fuel in them, and what ends up happening is there's condensation in the wintertime that builds inside of your metal tank, and it actually rusts the inside. Which brings us back to the whole K100 thing. If customers use our K100 and put that straight into their jerry can, they can fill up all of their machines, their lawnmowers, their riding lawnmowers, their snowblowers, blowers, they're leaf blowers. You can mix it in with 2-stroke fuel, your weed eaters, your chainsaws, and you'll never have to worry about your tanks rusting because you'll be leaving fuel inside of it, and you don't have to worry about water getting in there because it turns water into burnable fuel. Okay, so you guys are going to try and pull on this, and you're going to see that it's not pulling through, and that's because we have our fuel line still hooked up. So what I'm going to do is disconnect the little fuel line clamp that they have there just with a set of pliers and pull that up. We're going to disconnect the fuel line, and then any fuel that's left over in the tank I'm going to drain into just a little clean jar to inspect what the fuel looks like. Okay, I got the fuel draining out now, and our customer said that he hadn't used it since last year, and he went to fire it up and it just wouldn't fire up. So I'm guessing it's probably a mixture of old fuel and, you know, just a gummed up carburetor. So I'm going to finish letting this drain out, and then we'll go ahead and finish removing that carburetor. Okay, so I've drained the fuel, and it was still dripping a little bit, so I just took a pencil and just put it in just a little bit. You don't want to wedge it in there to the point where, you know, it starts making your fuel line a little oversized, but you want to get something that snugs in there nicely so that your fuel stops dripping out, so it doesn't just completely make a mess. So now we've got a little gasket here. You guys are going to want to remember what position that goes in. So we're just going to put that off to the side. Then you'll be able to pull out your carburetor, and to disconnect your linkages here, guys, it's pretty simple. This is your governor spring here. So what you're going to do is you're going to go and take that out of the little hole right there. And then there's a little slot on the top of this piece, and this is your throttle here, by the way, and it's slotted, so you guys can see that you know, this is your throttle working, and they got all sorts of lubricant on here, so that they must have had a binding issue or something. Now you guys want to rotate it to the point where your throttle cable lines up with the slot at the top of this, and you should be able to pull your throttle cable right up just like that and out, and then again go ahead, disconnect this spring, and now we should be able to pull our carburetor right off the studs. Now, I've had Hondas before, guys, where the carburetor, the aluminum carburetor, has seized itself to the steel studs here that come out from the engine. So what I recommend before we put this back together, we're going to take a little bit of nickel anti-seize and put it just not too close to the engine, but just over these studs, so that if this thing ever gets wet, you'll never have to worry about a corrosion issue. Because I've had these before, guys, where you know, the carburetors have literally fused themselves to the metal studs where these little holes are, and I had to take a pry bar, believe it or not, in behind here just to pry it out, and we ended up doing damage to a plastic little spacer in behind that we had to replace. So again, a little bit of nickel anti-seize will go a long way on this. But let's bring this over to the workbench and I'll show you how to take it apart. Okay, so we got our carburetor over here on the workbench. First thing we're going to do is open up this bottom drain plug, let out some of the fuel that's in here, because as soon as I go to tip this sideways, there's going to be all sorts of fuel that comes out from the bowl. So what we're going to do is loosen that off, drain the fuel out, and then I'll show you how to start taking this thing apart, guys. So we got a little container here that I'm draining the fuel into. I just took the 10mm bolt from the bottom off, and now our bowl is loose and our fuel is drained. So I'm going to go ahead and pull off the bottom bowl to this carburetor. And you guys can see I'm already getting all kinds of little bits of gunk all over my hands. And we do have a little bit of debris in the bottom of there. And now that we have our carburetor on the workbench, now's a good time to take off your choke lever. So this is your choke lever right here. You guys can see that as I press the choke lever over, it turns our butterfly valve there. Now on Hondas, it's really simple. Basically, you just pull this right up and off. That goes on that post there, and a little plastic post goes inside of that slot there. It's something like that. So it just kind of pops down on top. So you guys can go ahead and remove that and set it off to the side. So now what we're going to do, flip this up, and we're going to have a look inside of this carburetor. We're going to pull out our rod here, and we're going to take off our float with our needle valve right there on the bottom. We're going to set that off to the side, and chances are we have a clogged main jet, which it looks like there is some debris in there. So I'm going to show you guys how to get that out. So you guys are going to want to take a standard screwdriver, also known as a flathead, go in there and make sure you're depressing it down hard enough so that it doesn't slip out, because you guys can damage the main jet. That is the main jet inside of there, that piece of brass. So we're going to get that out just by unthreading it. You guys can see it's threaded all the way to the top there. So you guys are going to want to unthread that until it comes completely out. Now I have a screwdriver here. You guys can see it fits in perfectly, right? So it's just the right width to be able to slip down in there. And basically this is kind of known as my carburetor screwdriver. So basically I'm just going to press down and we're going to try and unthread that. We're going to keep going all the way until the point where it's loose, and then we're going to go upside down and give it a little smack on the workbench. And this is what we got, guys. Here's your main jet. So this is what allows the fuel to go through. You guys can see there's a little number on there, 753, and sure enough, that thing's clogged. So what I'm going to do is go and get what's known as an oxyacetylene tip cleaner, and basically you can use the inside of twist tie. You know, they're small enough where you can poke it through, but basically you just want to poke it through before you go and clean it to make sure that all the hard bits of dirt and debris are out of this jet. So an oxyacetylene tip cleaner, it's got all bunch of different sizes, so you guys can see from thicker stuff to thinner stuff. And basically, like I said, you just want to poke it through, make sure there's no hardened bits of dirt and debris, and then we'll go ahead and disassemble the rest of the carburetor, because whenever I clean a carburetor, I like to get it as disassembled as possible to the point where, you know, as much is taken apart. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and remove our throttle backstop here. So you guys can see our throttle here. That's our butterfly valve there, and this throttle stops up against that little backstop. Just try to remember how far out it is. And then what we're going to do is go ahead and remove this using a Phillips screwdriver. And then we're going to go ahead and remove that plastic piece right there. And just remember, guys, that that goes flush to the bottom piece of that plastic down onto the carburetor. There we go. There it is. So now we can take this, pull it out. Now there is a little piece of brass normally in the bottom of these things, so you're going to want to get that clean as well. Take your tip cleaner and poke out. You guys can see it's got little holes inside of it, so you're going to want to clean that out as well. But now we have access at that hole right there, so that'll allow us to clean it out as well. And you guys can see, you know, there is some bits of dirt and debris on top of this carburetor as well, so chances are it is just a gummed up carburetor that we got to get cleaned out. Now as for this is your air fuel ratio adjustment screw. You don't have to remove this, guys, because they put these caps on them from the factory that only allow you to turn them so much, so you can only get like maybe an eighth or a quarter of a turn here, and you don't actually need to remove that. It should be set and it should be fine where it is. Normally, if it didn't have that little backstop on it, I would remove it just to get it clean, but chances are it should be fine. And if this carburetor sputters once it's on, we should be able to fix that just by adjusting this right here. Okay, so we're almost ready to get this carburetor cleaned. What I'm going to do though is take a 10mm socket, and we're going to take the bottom of our fuel valve. So this is our fuel valve on and off right there. And because this is a kind carburetor that Hondas use, they integrate their fuel valve right into the carburetor. So what we're going to do is use a socket on that. We're going to unthread that and pull it off just to see what kind of dirt and debris is in the bottom of that. So this is known as a sediment bowl for your carburetor, and that's known as a sediment bowl for our fuel valve. Okay, so we got that off now, and we can see that, well, it doesn't look that bad. It looks fairly clean, and there is a little O-ring in here. You guys are going to want to go in there and inspect, and if there are chunks of dirt and debris in there, you guys are going to want to blast that out. Now for cleaning this carburetor, I'm going to be using an ultrasonic cleaner. So here's our ultrasonic cleaner here. I have to change the liquid in there because we already cleaned the carburetor. It has a little basket here, and basically there's two little vibrators on the bottom there. You crank this thing to a certain amount of time. Normally I do about 15 or 20 minutes, and it's also got a little heating element, so you can crank it up to a different temperature. And we're going to put our carburetor inside of this basket, and we're going to drop that basket into a mixture of industrial strength degreaser and some hot water that I take out of the kettle. Now normally I would just use this, but if you don't turn that on early enough, by the time you take your carburetor off, your liquid won't be warm enough. And the warmer the liquid is, the easier things start to break up inside of that carburetor. So normally I heat up a kettle, pour some of the hot water, not necessarily boiling, but hot water inside of here, mix in my industrial strength cleaner, and then mix in the rest of my liquid. And if you guys don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, go ahead and get yourself a can of Carb Cleaner. This is MotoMaster. We get it from like Canadian Tire here in Canada, but you can get this stuff from like a Napa, basically any kind of parts store. Carb Cleaner works pretty good, and what you guys want to do is take a nozzle just like that and blast any of the holes that you guys see. You want to get this carburetor as clean as possible. However, I've taken carburetors that we've cleaned with carburetor cleaner, and I've stuck them into ultrasonic cleaner, and you'd be surprised how much extra stuff comes out that you can't get to inside of the carburetor here, because there's all kinds of tiny little passageways in here, and the vibration from the ultrasonic cleaner, you know, it just melts all that stuff, and it just totally breaks it apart, and it all falls to the bottom of the ultrasonic cleaner. And after one use, guys, it's hard to believe, but after one use, and you guys saw the liquid, it's the same liquid, I just drained some of it out, but you guys can see just how much dirt and debris is in the bottom of this ultrasonic cleaner. You guys can see it's crazy. Now this was just after one carburetor clean. One carburetor clean, and all of this stuff came out. Where it came from, I don't know, because the carburetor that I did didn't seem that dirty, but this thing is crazy. They work awesome. It was about $300, so obviously quite the purchase, but basically for what we're doing here, we kind of need it. So like I said, let me get some fresh cleaning solution in there. We'll fire this thing up and get that carburetor clean. Okay, so we're going to add in a little bit of our hot water here. Then we're going to take some of our Indo 701 industrial strength detergent. Now this stuff is concentrated, guys, so you don't need that much. That should be good. Then we're going to go ahead and put the rest of our hot water in. Right up to about there, and we can get this carburetor in there. Okay, and as far as what we're putting into the ultrasonic cleaner, I'm going to be putting in our main jet. I'm going to be putting in this little metering rod here, and we're going to be putting in our carburetor as well. Okay, so I got our carburetor, and then as for the sediment bowl here, I just took the bolt and put it in upside down so that I can put my main jet and my little metering rod there in. And we're going to go ahead and put this into the water, and then we're going to turn this thing on. Now this thing makes a horrible noise when there's audio equipment filming, so I'm going to shut it off here before I turn this on. But I'll bring you back once this thing's all cleaned up. Okay, so while our carburetor's cleaning, I've flipped this up and just put an oil drain pan underneath. I use a cooking tray that's got about 2 inches of depth to it. It's nice and small, and I fit it right under there. Now I know that this snowblower has too much oil in it because when I went to unscrew the dipstick, which is on that side of the machine, oil started just coming out of it, and it's not supposed to. It's only supposed to be up to a certain point on the dipstick, and they've clearly overfilled it. So that's not good, but we're going to go ahead and get this oil drained. Now on the left side of this machine here, there is an oil cap. You guys are going to want to make sure that's tight, so go ahead and tighten that up. And you don't want to loosen that one off. But I got a snowblower engine back here in my shop that came from a $1,700 snowblower. It was brand new. The thing had heated hand grips and everything. And basically, guys, one of his little oil caps on the bottom that I just showed you either unthreaded itself due to the vibration of the engine, and what ended up happening was he lost his oil slowly over time, and he went to use it one day, and the connecting rod just snapped inside of the engine. So there's his connecting rod, or what's left of it anyways, and to prevent something like this from happening, guys, you want to make sure that you always check your oil before you use your machine, and you make sure that those little dipstick caps are nice and tight. But coming over to the right side of the machine, this is the cap that we're going to be using to check the level of oil. So once it's drained out and we fill it up with some oil, we're going to be using this to check the level because it does have a stick on the end of it. Basically the same thing happened when I went to unthread this. Oil just started pouring out. But what I'm going to do is drain the oil from this bolt here, and there's also one over here that you can use, but I think there's more room on the right side, so I'm going to go with that one. So go ahead and get yourself a wrench, loosen that off, and just let the oil start coming out. What you guys are going to want to do is after some of the oil starts coming out, you're going to want to loosen this off just to allow a little bit of airflow through there. And you should be able to loosen that off just by using a 10mm wrench. So we're going to let that drain out. You guys can see it there. So now that it's starting to drain, I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and it should increase the flow of oil coming out. Now it might make a little bit of a mess, but this is really the only way to do it without you know, tipping it on its side or having to remove a track. This is probably the easiest way. So once this is drained out, what I'm going to do is wipe all that up and make sure there's no oil on his frame. But as you guys can see, oil is only supposed to come up to the top of there. You're not supposed to put it above the threads. So what ended up happening was when I first went to unscrew this before I started the machine up, I always check oil before I start the machine up. And as soon as I unthreaded this, oil started pouring out all over the place, which led me to believe that someone had overfilled this with oil, which is never a good thing, guys. I've also gone ahead and put a couple 2x4s underneath the front just to bring it up so that it's level front and back, so that the oil drains and it's not facing forward like it was. And as soon as I tilted it back there to kind of level things out, more oil started coming out. So I'm just going to let it sit for a little while, because you guys got to remember that you probably won't ever get all of the old oil out of the machine unless you do what's known as an oil flush, which is basically you change the oil and then after you're done, you change it again and you use fresh oil to flush out the oil that you just put in there. And what that does is exactly what it sounds like. It flushes out all the old oil and replaces it with fresh oil. So now that we have the fuel and the oil drained out of it, I've flipped it up so that no oil is going to get into the overhead valves. But as we can see here, our engine comes out with a shaft that bolts to this right here, which is like our transmission. And basically, guys, Honda, they use just a straight shaft with a gearbox, right? So you have a shifter linkage that goes down to our gearbox here. An axle comes out, and it's axle driven, so it doesn't run a friction wheel like a normal Craftsman or Mastercraft MTD snowblower would. That's why you're paying the money that you do for a Honda, because it's built to a higher quality. But this is a good time to inspect all of the linkages and basically the underside of the machine. So because everything looks to be in good condition, I'm going to flip it back down and we'll get ready to put some fresh oil into this thing. Okay, so we got it flipped back down. And I know that this snowblower takes 5W30 oil, which is a winter oil. So you guys can see right here on the side of the machine where there's a sticker, you guys can see the oil level, right? Clearly below the threads. So when I unthreaded that thing, there was oil coming out because someone had filled this thing way above that. So they would have ended up flipping this thing on the side to get a little bit of extra oil in there, which is never a good thing, guys. But if you want to double check how much oil goes into this thing, come over to the right side of the machine, right where we are here, and you'll see stamped into the side of the engine. So it's a GCAAK-1607-128. There's your number right there. So you can go online and type that into Google, and normally something will pop up which will let you know all of your specifications for this engine, and it'll tell you exactly how much oil this takes. It'll be an oil capacity. You could even go and type in Honda HS622 oil capacity in Google, and chances are it'll pop right up and you'll be able to find out. So as you guys can see, popping up on the left side of your screen, I Googled Honda HS622 oil capacity. It came right up, and I clicked on the first link, and that's basically just an owner's manual. But what it said was 0.60 liters. That's 600 milliliters of oil, and that's how much oil this thing takes. So we're going to be using some premium Castrol GTX 5W30. You guys can see it right there. So what I'm going to do is measure out 600 milliliters, and I can do that using one of my smaller jugs. Now this was a 5W30 jug, but you guys can see that on the side here, it has a little clear area where you can measure out exactly so many ounces. 20 ounces is 600 milliliters. So basically I'm just going to fill it up to 600. Okay, and once you got your fresh oil all measured out, go ahead and get yourself a clean funnel, and then we're going to slowly pour into here. So like I said, guys, measure out about 600 and then just kind of slowly add it until you get around to about 100 milliliters left, and then you want to start going a little slower and putting your dipstick back in and double checking as you go. Because like I always say, it's easier to add oil than it is to take it out. When you add it, you know exactly how much you're putting in. But when you go to take it out again, you don't really know how much is coming out, because then you got to undo the oil drain plug, then you got to, plug it back up, and you got to add more oil, and it's just a back and forth. So go slow and you'll be fine. So take your dipstick, wipe it off with a clean rag. Thread it all the way in, because on this model it says specifically to thread it in and then thread it out. And just like I showed you here before, you want to make sure that the oil goes up right below the threads. So I'm not sure if you guys can see it here, but I'll take this rag. We're going to stick the rag on there and we're going to lift this off, and you guys can see that we're just starting to hit the dipstick, and we're about right up to there. So a little bit more and we should be good to go. Well, this is the first time this has ever happened, guys, but this thing took exactly 600 milliliters of oil, to the point where right up to the threads now, we have oil. So we're exactly where we're supposed to be as per the manual recommends, just below those threads. So I'm going to go ahead, put this back in, and our oil change is now complete. Yeah, so like I said, that thing ended up taking a full 600 milliliters after an oil change. So props to Honda for you know, having those specs right on the money. Because other times I've gone and changed oil on like a Craftsman or a Mastercraft, MTD, whatever it is, and it'll say like, you know, add in 24 ounces of oil, and you end up putting 22 in. You drained out all the oil, and it's right on the money at 22, and it's like 2 ounces less than what they call for in the manual. So like I said, props to Honda for having that spec right on the money. Now I would normally remove steel fuel tanks on Hondas, like I said, because they are prone to rusting. But I've came in here and checked the interior of this tank, and it looks fairly clean. And we know that the fuel filter here is clean and free of debris because when we popped the fuel line off, fuel was coming out. So it's not a case of a clogged fuel filter inside of the tank here. Like I said, it's probably the carburetor. And if you guys are wondering how the fuel gauge here works from E to F, they have a little floaty there. So it's basically a metal arm onto a plastic ball. As the fuel goes in, that ball raises because it floats, and that thing lifts up. So I'm just operating that with my finger there, but you guys can see pretty simple design. So because everything is clean inside of there and it works as it should, I'm not going to remove this tank. Okay, so we got the carburetor out of the ultrasonic cleaner now. You guys can see it is absolutely spotless. So I'm just going to take my compressor here and blow out basically everything. I'm going to blow out the metering rod that's way down underneath where the main jet goes. Blow out any holes you can see, and that'll make sure that they're nice and free and clear of debris. And you can see there a little bit of water came out too. That should be good. Okay, I got the bottom bowl piece to our fuel valve screwed back on. And basically I'm going to go ahead and put our float with our needle valve back in, slide the rod in, then we can go ahead and screw in our main jet. Okay, and once you get your main jet screwed back in there and your float, then go ahead and put your sediment bowl back on here. Now when you put your sediment bowl back on, you want to make sure that your fuel valve is on the right side and your drain here comes out to the left, because you guys are going to want to remember that when this is on, this is going to come out to the side, so you'll be able to drain the fuel out. If you ever want to drain your fuel out of your bowl, you're going to have access to that. So you want to make sure that that comes out to the left. Then before I go any farther, I'm going to use a carburetor pressure testing tool. Basically we're going to hook this line up to where your fuel line goes, and we're going to turn the fuel valve on, and then with this in the upside down position, we're going to pump that up right there, and you guys are going to be able to see this go up. And if it holds a certain amount of PSI, we know that the needle valve in there that hangs off of the float is seating properly. If it doesn't, let's say it goes to about 10 PSI and then it starts to drop slowly, that means that we have a slow leak, which would mean that when you go to turn your fuel valve on, if you left your machine to sit, fuel would come through your gas tank into your carburetor, into your cylinder, and then down into your bottom end. But we can see here that we're holding just over 5 PSI, so we know that that needle valve is making a good seat. So we'll go ahead and disconnect that and we'll finish off this carburetor. Okay, then you want to take your little plastic metering rod there and put that back down in, and then we can go ahead and take our throttle backstop, screw that back into the same position that it was. Then taking our choke handle, we can go ahead and pop that back into the right position, and this carburetor is ready to go back onto our machine. But before we do, go ahead and take a little bit of nickel anti-seize if you have it, and put just a little bit onto those studs there. Okay, so the first thing I've done was hooked up our fuel line and put our fuel clamp back into position. Next, I'll hook up our throttle linkage. And again, you guys are just going to want to rotate that into position until it falls right into place, and you should be able to turn it with no binding at all, and then go ahead and hook up your spring to the little hole there. Okay, now we can go ahead and push our carburetor back into position. Then take your gasket here and slip that on, remembering to have all your holes lined up just like I do there, guys, so you don't want to put that thing on upside down by mistake. Then we can go ahead and take this shroud and slide that over the same way we took it off. And when you have your choke and your fuel valve in that position, it should just slip right on. So go ahead and get your 10mm nuts and tighten that up. Okay, and once you get those tightened up, go ahead and put your 10mm bolt into there and then get that tightened up. Once you get that tightened up, before you go any farther, we're going to disconnect our spark plug cap. We're going to remove our spark plug, check to make sure that it's the right spark plug to begin with. Then if it's the right plug, we're going to clean it, gap it, and put it back in. And using a 13/16 inch spark plug socket, we were able to get the plug out. And this is what our plug looks like, guys. So you can see this is what's known as a fouled plug. It's got all kinds of nasty carbon built up onto it and probably burnt oil byproducts. Again, this was most likely because the oil hadn't been changed and it was actually overfilled with oil, which was causing this engine to burn a little bit of oil because it was getting into the top end. So how I'm going to clean this up is I have a wire wheel here on my bench grinder, and I'm just going to take it and clean it up on the bench grinder with the wire wheel there. Now I'm going to use a spark plug gap tool, and the owner's manual specifies anywhere between 28 and I believe 30 thousandths, so we're probably going to put it right to 30 thousandths of an inch, just like I normally do with the majority of plugs these days. Now this is a Denso W16 EPR. Now you guys can see on the left here popping up on your screen, that is the owner's manual, and it recommends that it should take a BPR 5ES NGK or a W16 EPR, which is this one right here. So this is the right plug. So I'm going to go ahead and get that cleaned up, and we'll get that back into the machine. You guys can see what a difference that wire wheel makes. This thing looks like a brand new plug. Okay, so we got that all cleaned up, and using a spark plug gap tool, I've gapped this to 30 thousandths of an inch. Okay, and once you pop your spark plug cap back on, now we're ready for our top shroud to go back on. So we're going to fit that in, and it should pop right into position. So now we can go ahead and get our bolt back there in, and our bolt down here at the front. You're just going to have to line that up, and then we'll go ahead and get that bolt over here last, once we get everything in the right position. Just remember that your short bolt goes on the back, and then this longer one goes at the front. So short one back here, and then the longer one goes right there. Now that little piece with the nut welded onto it, that slips under there, and this hole that the bolt goes through is slotted. Now I believe what that does is it just sets your slow position, so you go over, and depending on where that little bracket is behind there, it only allows you to go so far over with your governor here. So I just put it in the same spot that it was, and I think this should be good. So now we'll go ahead and put our air box back on top here with your little washer on top and our wing nut. Get that tightened down. We'll put a little bit of fresh fuel into this thing with our K100 already mixed into our jerry can, and I'll bring this thing outside and we'll fire it up for you guys. Sounds pretty good to me. This thing works awesome, guys. So this machine is fully serviced and ready to be returned back to the customer. So that's it for today's tune-up. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to leave me a thumbs up. You can click here to subscribe, and you can click here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every week, so be sure to come on back next week and check the channel out for new exciting content every single week. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.